It all began with a dream, the American dream, some might call it. Eugene Butler was born in the bustling state of New York in 1848, a world of ordered towns and established ways. But something about the untamed horizon called to him. It was a siren song of endless land and opportunity. In the early 1880s, he answered that call, journeying west to the vast, wind-swept Dakota Territory. Here, on the raw frontier, he wasn't just a settler, he was a founder. Alongside others, he helped establish the small town of Niagara, a tiny pinprick on a sprawling map of promise. It was here that he would build his legacy, or so everyone thought. His ambition was as wide as the Dakota sky. Butler acquired a substantial plot of land, 480 acres to start, and with a quiet determination, he began to work it. He was a farmer, a man of the earth, and the earth was good to him. Year after year, his farm grew. His wealth accumulated and his reputation as a successful, if solitary man solidified. By the turn of the century, his holdings were immense, worth what would be well over $1 million today. He was a pillar of the community he helped create, a testament to the rewards of hard work and pioneer spirit. But was he? Or was there something else growing in the fertile soil of his isolated farm? Beneath the surface of this success story, a different narrative was taking shape. Eugene Butler was a man of contradictions. He was a wealthy landowner who lived a life of stark simplicity, a community founder who shunned the company of others. He never married, never started a family, choosing instead to live as a bachelor on his sprawling, lonely estate. The neighbors saw him as eccentric, a bit of an oddity, but in the rugged individualism of the frontier, a little strangeness was often overlooked. After all, he was a hard worker, a man who had carved a fortune from the unforgiving plains. Who were they to judge the peculiar habits of a self-made man? But as the years passed, the eccentricity began to curdle into something darker. The quiet farmer became a figure of local lore, a man defined by his isolation and his increasingly bizarre behaviors. He was building more than a farm. He was building walls around himself, both physical and psychological. The man who had once been a pioneer, looking out at an open future, was now a recluse, looking inward at a world of his own making. And it was a world filled with shadows, a place where the line between reality and delusion was beginning to fade into the twilight of the empty plains. What secrets was he guarding in that solitary kingdom? The answer would prove more horrifying than anyone could ever imagine. In the small, quiet town of Niagara, the nights were usually still, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. But sometimes, another sound would pierce the darkness. It was the frantic beat of horses' hooves, accompanied by a chilling, guttural scream that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night itself. This was Eugene Butler on his nightly ride. The locals called him the Midnight Rider, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They would see his silhouette of moss in Aowan, a lone figure on horseback, galloping wildly across his fields under the cold light of the moon. Why did he do it? Was he chasing something, or was something chasing him? Butler's strangeness wasn't confined to his nocturnal excursions. His life was governed by a set of rigid, peculiar beliefs that grew more intense with each passing year. He developed an almost pathological fear of being photographed, convinced that the camera's flash would steal his very soul. He would recoil from any attempt to capture his image, as if the lens were the barrel of a gun. This fear extended to other aspects of his life. He saw plots everywhere. He believed the local widows were conspiring to marry him for his money, their friendly greetings twisted in his mind into predatory advances. He was a man living in a fortress of his own paranoia. His interactions with the world became a series of suspicious, fearful encounters. He trusted no one, especially not the farmhands he hired to help work his vast property. These men, often drifters or transient laborers, were a necessary evil in his eyes. He needed their help, but he was certain they were all thieves, just waiting for the chance to rob him blind. He would watch them with a hawk-like intensity, his mind cataloging every perceived slight, every misplaced tool, as evidence of their treachery. This gnawing suspicion would become an obsession, a dark seed planted in the fertile ground of his increasingly fragile mind. How far would a man go to protect what was his from threats that might only exist in his head? The paradox of Eugene Butler was that he craved isolation, yet seemed to be in a constant, frantic battle with the world he imagined was encroaching upon him. He was a wealthy man who lived in squalor, a landowner who behaved like a hunted animal. The people of Niagara watched from a distance, shaking their heads at the strange, lonely figure in their midst. They saw an eccentric, a recluse, perhaps even a madman. But no one, not in their wildest nightmares, could have guessed the true nature of the darkness that was consuming the Midnight Rider. They saw the strange behavior, but they couldn't see the secrets buried just beneath the floorboards of his quiet, unassuming farmhouse. By the early 1900s, Eugene Butler's eccentricities had spiraled into a full-blown mental crisis. The whispers of paranoia that had long echoed in his mind now roared into a cacophony of delusion. He began to experience vivid hallucinations, seeing and hearing things that weren't there. The threats he had once imagined became terrifyingly real to him. He would speak of phantom persecutors, of shadowy figures lurking at the edges of his property, all intent on stealing his hard-earned fortune. His reality was fracturing piece by piece, leaving him stranded in a terrifying landscape of his own creation. The Midnight Rider was no longer just riding, he was fleeing from the ghosts that haunted his waking hours. His family, who had watched his slow decline from a distance, could no longer stand by. His behavior had become too erratic, his delusions too profound. For his own safety, and perhaps for the safety of others, they knew something had to be done. In 1904, they made the difficult decision to have him committed. Eugene was taken to the North Dakota State Hospital in Jamestown, a place for those whose minds had betrayed them. When he was admitted, the hospital staff made a startling discovery. Hidden in the pockets of the disheveled farmer's clothes was over $7,600 in cash and gold, a staggering sum, equivalent to around $200,000 today. He was the wealthiest patient the institution had ever seen. But once inside the asylum's walls, a strange transformation occurred. The paranoid, screaming Midnight Rider seemed to vanish. In his place was a quiet, harmless, and surprisingly sociable man. The hospital staff described him as non-violent and cooperative. The demons that had plagued him on his isolated farm appeared to recede in the structured, secure environment of the hospital. He was no longer the master of a lonely kingdom he had to defend. Here, he was just another patient, and in that anonymity, he seemed to find a measure of peace. He even, the records show, fell in love with one of the nurses, a gentle affection that stood in stark contrast to the paranoid fear he once held for women. For the next 7 years, Eugene Butler lived out his days in the relative tranquility of the asylum. He never spoke of any crimes. He never hinted at the gruesome secrets hidden beneath his farmhouse. He was, by all accounts, a model patient. On October 22, 1911, at the age of 62, Eugene Butler died peacefully from phlebitis, an inflammation of a vein. His body was claimed by his relatives and taken back to New York for burial. The story of the eccentric farmer from Niagara seemed to have reached its quiet, unremarkable end. But the real story, the one written in blood and bone, was still waiting to be discovered. The earth on his abandoned farm held its breath, guarding a terrible truth. For 4 long years after Eugene Butler's death, the farm sat silent, the fields grew wild, and the farmhouse stood empty, a lonely monument to its strange former owner. The stories of the Midnight Rider began to fade into local legend, a curious tale to be told on a dark night. But, in June of 1915, the silence was shattered. The new owners of the property decided to make some improvements, starting with the excavation of a proper cellar beneath the old house. It was a routine job, a simple task of digging out dirt and stone. No one expected to find anything more than earth and rock. They were wrong, terribly wrong. As the workers dug deeper into the cool, dark soil under the house, their shovels struck something that wasn't stone, it was bone. At first they might have thought it was an animal, long buried and forgotten, but as they cleared away more dirt, the horrifying truth began to reveal itself. This was not an animal. It was a human skeleton. And then another, and another. Panic must have set in as the grim discovery continued. They had unearthed a hidden grave, a secret tomb tucked away in the very foundation of the house. The routine excavation had just become a portal into a nightmare. The authorities were called, and a more careful, methodical excavation began. What they found was a carefully constructed charnel house. 5 skeletons were discovered packed together in a concealed shaft, a makeshift mass grave. A 6th skeleton was found separately, hidden beneath a trap door in another part of the cellar. The placement suggested 2 distinct burial events, 2 separate episodes of unimaginable violence. The scene told a story of cold, calculated effort. This was no crime of passion. This was the work of someone who had killed and then taken great care to hide the evidence of his deeds, burying his victims where no one would ever think to look. The forensic examination, as rudimentary as it was in 1915, painted a chillingly consistent picture of the violence. Each of the 6 victims had been murdered in the exact same way. A powerful, crushing blow to the left side of the head. Their skulls had been shattered by a precise and brutal impact. The killer was methodical, consistent, and merciless. Furthermore, at least 2 of the skeletons had broken legs, injuries that investigators believed were inflicted after death. Why? The gruesome conclusion was that Butler had snapped their bones simply to make the bodies fit more easily into their shallow earthen graves. It was a final, brutal indignity inflicted upon his unknown victims. The discovery of 6 bodies turned the small town of Niagara upside down. The immediate question on everyone's lips was, who were these poor souls? Sheriff's deputies and investigators descended on the Butler farm, launching an investigation that was immediately fraught with challenges. The primary suspect, Eugene Butler, was already 4 years in his grave, unable to answer for the horrors unearthed in his cellar. He could not be interrogated, could not be forced to confront his crimes. The investigation had to piece together a puzzle without its most crucial piece. All they had were the bones and the chilling silence of the man who had put them there. Identifying the victims proved to be an impossible task. The skeletons were bare, stripped of all flesh, and just as importantly, all clothing and personal effects. Butler had taken the time to remove anything that might lead back to a name, a family, or a past. Investigators checked missing persons reports from the surrounding area, but found no matches. The victims seemed to have vanished without a trace, their disappearances going unnoticed or unreported. Were they drifters, itinerant farmhands, people with no family to sound the alarm when they suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth? The lack of records left a void that was quickly filled by speculation and theory. Several theories emerged, each attempting to put a face to the anonymous bones. The most prevalent theory was that the victims were some of the many farmhands Butler had employed over the years, men who came to work for a season, and then, it was assumed, simply moved on. Had Butler's paranoia about being robbed by his helpers driven him to murder them one by one? Another, more specific lead pointed to a young man named John Urbanski, who had disappeared in 1902 while working for a bachelor farmer near Niagara. Could he have been one of the 6? Other, wilder theories circulated, suggesting the victims were a visiting family, or even former housekeepers and their children, though all the skeletons were identified as male. The investigation was further complicated by the public's morbid fascination with the case. As news of the murder farm spread, hundreds of curiosity seekers flocked to the property. The site, which should have been a carefully preserved crime scene, turned into a chaotic public spectacle. In the frenzy, people trampled over evidence, and some even took bones as gruesome souvenirs. This contamination and theft of evidence destroyed any hope of a thorough forensic analysis, even by the standards of the day. The remaining bones were eventually lost or discarded, ensuring that the victims would remain nameless forever, their identities scattered and lost to time, just like their lives. The news of the discovery at the Butler farm hit the tiny community of Niagara like a physical blow. This was a town of only about 150 people, a place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. They had known Eugene Butler. He was the eccentric recluse, the midnight rider, the strange but ultimately harmless old farmer. The idea that this familiar figure was in fact a monstrous serial killer was almost impossible to process. The man they had watched gallop across the plains at night, the man they had whispered about for his strange fears, was not just mad. He was a murderer of the most brutal kind. The revelation sent a wave of shock and fear through the community. People who had lived alongside Butler for decades were forced to re-examine every memory, every strange encounter. The screams they had heard in the night suddenly took on a new, terrifying meaning. Were those the cries of a madman, or the echoes of his victims? Neighbors who had once dismissed his paranoia as harmless eccentricity now wondered if they had narrowly escaped a similar fate. The trust that holds a small town together was fractured. If a man like Eugene Butler could hide such darkness, who else could be hiding secrets? The ground beneath their feet no longer felt quite so solid. The press, of course, had a field day. Newspapers across North Dakota and beyond seized upon the gruesome tale, plastering sensational headlines across their front pages. They dubbed Butler the Great Plains Butcher and the Fiend of Niagara. The story had all the elements of a gothic horror novel: a reclusive millionaire, a lonely farmhouse, and a secret cellar filled with skeletons. The media frenzy amplified the town's shock and drew even more attention to the case, turning Niagara into a temporary tourist destination for the morbidly curious. The town's quiet obscurity was shattered, replaced by an infamous reputation it never wanted. For the people of Niagara, the discovery was a communal trauma. They had to live with the knowledge that unspeakable acts had occurred right in their midst, completely undetected. The Butler farm became a landmark of horror, a place parents warned their children to avoid. The story of the Midnight Rider was no longer a quirky local legend. It was a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind a placid facade. The shock would eventually fade, but the memory would linger, a permanent scar on the town's history. Eugene Butler had not only taken 6 lives, he had also stolen the innocence of the community he helped to build. Years after the grim discovery, long after the newspaper headlines faded, the question of Eugene Butler's mind remains. What could possibly drive a man to commit such methodical, brutal acts and then live peacefully, as if nothing had happened? Modern experts, looking back at the case with the benefit of a century of psychiatric knowledge, have tried to assemble a psychological portrait of the killer. The consensus points towards a severe psychotic disorder, most likely paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis helps to frame the bizarre behaviors that his neighbors witnessed for so many years, casting them in a new, more clinical light. The key symptoms are all there. Butler suffered from powerful delusions, both persecutory and grandiose. He was convinced that people were plotting to steal his wealth, a classic persecutory delusion. At the same time, his belief that all the local widows desired him suggests a grandiose element to his thinking. His terror of cameras and his screaming nocturnal rides can be seen as manifestations of his extreme paranoia and internal turmoil. The hallucinations his family reported before his commitment are another hallmark of schizophrenia, a sign that his brain was creating a reality that was terrifyingly and convincingly real to him, and to him alone. What is perhaps most fascinating and most chilling is the probable motive for the murders. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sadistic pleasure or a lust for power, Butler's violence seems to have been a direct result of his paranoid delusions. In his fractured mind, the farmhands he hired were not just potential thieves, they were active, imminent threats to his very existence and everything he had built. The murders in his view may not have been acts of malice but horrifying acts of self-defense against a phantom menace. He was not killing for sport, he was in his mind exterminating a threat. This might explain the methodical, almost detached nature of the crimes. This psychological framework also helps explain his dramatic change in behavior once he was institutionalized. In the asylum, he was removed from the source of his paranoia, his farm, his wealth, and the strangers he hired to work for him. The perceived threats were gone. With no property to defend and no thieves to guard against, the trigger for his violence was removed. This allowed the quieter, more sociable side of his personality to emerge. He wasn't faking his madness on the farm, nor was he faking his sanity in the asylum. He was a man whose violent potential was inextricably linked to a specific, delusional context, a context that vanished the moment he was committed. When we think of serial killers from that era, certain names immediately come to mind. There was H.H. Holmes, the cunning Chicago pharmacist who built a murder castle to trap and kill his victims, often for financial gain. And there was Belle Gunness, the Indiana Black Widow, who lured suitors to her farm with promises of marriage, only to murder them and steal their life savings. These were killers who operated in the shadows of bustling towns or on busy farmsteads, their motives often a twisted mix of greed and cruelty. They became infamous, their stories cautionary tales of urban predators and rural monsters. But Eugene Butler doesn't quite fit the mold. He stands apart, a strange and solitary figure in the grim annals of American crime. Unlike Holmes or Gunness, his primary motive does not appear to have been financial. He was already a wealthy man, he didn't need to kill for money. In fact, his wealth seemed to be the source of his torment, the catalyst for the paranoia that drove him to murder. He killed not to acquire wealth, but to protect the wealth he already had from threats that were likely imaginary. This makes him a very different kind of predator, one driven by internal demons rather than external desires. The context of his crimes was also unique. Holmes operated amidst the anonymity of a large city, using the chaos of the World's Fair to his advantage. Gunnis, while rural, had a steady stream of victims delivered to her doorstep through Lonely Hearts ads. Butler, however, was a killer of the isolated frontier. His farm was his kingdom and his prison. His victims were likely transit laborers, men on the fringe of society whose disappearances would go unnoticed. He was a lone wolf, his hunting ground the vast, empty expanse of his own property. His crimes were as isolated and hidden as the man himself. Perhaps the most significant difference is the discovery. The crimes of Holmes and Gunnis came to light while they were still alive or immediately after their deaths, leading to sensational investigations and trials that captivated the nation. Their legends were built in real time. But Butler's secret remained buried, literally, for years after he was gone. He died a peaceful death in a mental institution, remembered as a harmless eccentric. The discovery of his crimes was a posthumous revelation, a ghost story come to life. This delay separated the man from his deeds, creating a mystery where there could be no confession, no trial, and no justice for the 6 nameless men in his cellar. The story of Eugene Butler is a haunting reminder that the deepest secrets are often hidden in plain sight. For years he lived among his neighbors, a man whose profound strangeness was dismissed as harmless eccentricity. No one saw the monster lurking behind the paranoid delusions of the Midnight Rider. His secret remained safe, protected by his isolation and the community's willingness to look the other way. It's a chilling thought that the screams in the night were not just the ramblings of a madman, but potentially the echoes of murder, and no one ever knew to ask the right questions. The secret was kept because no one could conceive of a horror so great existing in their small, quiet world. The public's fascination with the case, both in 1915 and today, speaks to our enduring fear of the unknown. The Butler farm became a symbol of the hidden darkness that can lie beneath the most ordinary surfaces. It taps into a primal fear that the neighbor you know, the quiet man down the road, could be harboring a terrible secret. The fact that the victims were never identified only adds to the mystery's haunting power. They remain silent witnesses, their stories untold, their names lost to the winds of the Dakota Plains. They are every forgotten soul, every person who has slipped through the cracks of society. Could a case like this happen today? It's hard to say. With modern technology, DNA analysis, and better record-keeping for missing persons, it seems less likely that 6 people could vanish without a trace. And yet, the core elements of the story, isolation, mental illness, and a community's failure to see the warning signs, are timeless. The story of Eugene Butler serves as a stark lesson. It forces us to wonder about the secrets the earth still holds, about the stories buried just beneath our feet. How many other tales of darkness have been silently absorbed by the soil, waiting for an errant shovel to bring them into the light? In the end, the case of the Midnight Rider is a story without a conclusion. There was no trial, no conviction, and no justice for the 6 men who died at his hand. All that remains is a chilling legend and a series of unanswered questions. Eugene Butler, the pioneer who helped build a town, became the boogeyman who would haunt it for a century. His name is now forever linked not to the prosperity he built, but to the graves he dug in the dark. The echoes of his crimes still resonate from that cold Dakota earth, a permanent and terrifying mystery etched into the history of the plains.